Get your hands on stylish t-shirts, hoodies, and more at wearbuff.com. That's WEARBUF.com. And make sure to use the promo code TWB at checkout for 20% off your first order. Stay Buffalo proud with Wear Buff. Myles Garrett has requested a trade out of Cleveland. Are the Bills realistic contenders to bring him in? We'll talk about it this week on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo Fanbase Podcast Network. My name is Justin, and I am your host, and we're kind of starting the offseason out with, we're not even in the offseason of the NFL yet, but I think it certainly kind of feels that way. I don't know about any of you listening. This year feels different. I usually, can lick my wounds after a loss for a couple weeks and still bounce back and still want to watch the Super Bowl. I have no interest this year. So I'm going right into off-season mode, and the transition was really helped out by the breaking news of Myles Garrett requesting a trade out of Cleveland. And I had an episode lined up for this week, kind of going over evaluating Brandon Beane as we move into, getting closer to free agency, the draft, kind of taking a look at his resume since he's come to the Bills. So that episode will be coming likely next week. Maybe something else will happen that's, newsworthy to talk about. But I did want to take the time on this episode to kind of talk a little bit about the Myles Garrett situation. And, is it a little bit of a pipe dream? Is it likely to happen? And I don't know. When Myles Garrett says that, one of his conditions is wanting to go to a contender, to me, that eliminates at least a third of the league. You can take the teams that were in the playoffs this year. You can take some teams that you think, are on the cusp or, just had a weird down year due to injury, something like that. But it does put the Bills in the conversation for a player like that, right? Now, there's so much more that goes into it of, he's going to need a reworked contract. What's it going to cost to bring him in? All of those things are in play. But also, it's a nice little, pipe dream and let the kid have fun for a little bit. So, kind of part of getting into the offseason is going to be looking at where the Bills have come up short, what they can do to retool the roster to be able to reload and, maybe finally get over the hump next year. And my biggest position of need for this team was going to be and continues to be defensive line, and in particular, an edge defender. And, we've heard Sean McDermott after the season talk about, to win a Super Bowl, you need 2 to 3 difference makers on each side of the ball. We've heard Brandon Beane talk about, having game wreckers on defense. And in the past, he's talked about, like getting a player like one of the Bosas and how difficult it can be when you're, not drafting top 10. And that's kind of where I've landed on this conversation is when the Bills are having the level of success that they've been having, it's hard to find those, like blue chip edge rushers in, the late 20s, late first round, early second round type players. And I think there's plenty of positions where we see guys get taken in later rounds. Like, for example, wide receiver, running back, tight end. Every year there's guys coming out that, slip to the third, fourth, fifth round that go to the right situation, that have the right team around them. And honestly, just kind of like an influx of talent at those positions that you might be able to wait and see on a guy like that. Edge defenders, it's one of those positions where you don't you don't really see very often, a guy taken in the fifth round that everybody slept on that just blows up. It just doesn't happen that frequently. And when you're in that position, you're left pretty thin on options. And, you know, taking the player out of it, being Myles Garrett, it's not my favorite move to send considerable assets to another team and have to figure out a contract for a guy that's going to be something like $30 million for a guy that's going to be hitting his age 30 season. It's not it's not the most ideal, way to acquire that guy. The ideal way is, draft, develop, resign. Like I said, we're going to be drafting at the end of the first round again. And, you know, we found Groot at the end of the first round, and I like the player that Groot is. I like who he's developing into. I think there was also some really weird circumstances around that draft that let him fall that late in the draft. And, being the COVID year and all that weird stuff going on, I think in most normal years, he's not making it to the tail end of the first round. So that kind of leaves you with the options of acquiring a proven commodity, and you have to pay the king's ransom for that. You have to pay the big salary, and it's not ideal. But when I look at what a common theme has been in Bills playoff elimination games is pretty consistently the defensive line and not being able to affect the opposing quarterback enough. And if you're talking about a guy that can do that, Myles Garrett is maybe the best in the league at doing that. So kind of looking at situations, different ideas of what it might take. I've as soon as something like this gets announced, you go to the social medias and you'll see all kinds of wild ideas out there. And I've seen a lot of ideas of including Groot as a player in the trade, including Ed Oliver. I will say that, like, if a trade like this were to happen and that's the contingency to get it done, I think there's certainly an argument for, moving from Groot. Oh, he's coming up on needing a new contract himself. It's going to be, at least mid-20s range probably. And at a certain point, you have limited resources, and how much money do you want to tie up? I could see that being, a possibility of not being positive you want to pay him and kind of maybe drafting another guy, resetting the clock on that. I don't love those ideas. And I think those ideas typically come up in like this manner of, well, we have to conserve our picks. And for me, first of all, I don't think Myles Garrett goes for multiple ones. I think you're talking a first round pick and then, maybe a 3, 4, maybe a 2 to sweeten the pot. I don't think it's going to take multiple ones. Even if it did, I mean, I look at it in the perspective of we're going to be drafting a guy at 30. So if that's the pick you give up this year, just pretend you drafted Myles Garrett. And then say you have to give up another one next year. hopefully Myles Garrett put you over the top and you won a Super Bowl. So you're talking pick 32. And if, I could hand you a piece of paper today and make that chalk, make it happen, that it cost you, your draft pick this year and you gave up a pick 32 next year and the Bills won a Super Bowl. I don't know anybody in Bills Mafia that's not signing up for that. Drop a comment if you disagree. But to me, I think there's a certain level of us as fans overvaluing picks. And it's not to say that they're not valuable. You get the cost controlled rookie deal, the first round pick, you get the 5th-year option. And that stuff does matter. But in particular, when you're talking about a position like the edge, that's harder to find, that, you don't have a bevy of superstar defensive ends available in free agency every year. It's something, it's going to cost you. That being said, pretty confident that 31 teams in the NFL are at least making a phone call about that and making some sort of offer. Now, something that does play into the Bills' favor is Myles Garrett does have a no trade clause. So he does get to, have some say in where he goes. I would say probably take the Bengals, the Ravens, the Steelers out of the mix. If I'm the Browns, I don't really care if you have a sweeter deal to offer me. I'm not sending that monster to a division rival. But Myles Garrett kind of just got the balls turning for me, the wheels moving, whatever the expression is here, about options at edge. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be Myles Garrett. That's just, the Ferrari of options right now. And one thing that I do think goes into this conversation is a little bit of scar tissue from the Von Miller deal. And yes, like objectively from the outside, like it was a whiff of a signing. We gave him a massive contract in free agency and he gets hurt and, now it's still kind of effective, but definitely not the player that you paid to come in. For me, I would say to that, before the injury, Von Miller was every bit of the player that we paid him to come in and be. The downside is we got it for 11 weeks of the regular season and didn't have it for the playoffs. And, coming back from that injury in your 30s, it's difficult. But for me, I would say that's kind of like operating too much in revisionist history, if you will. In football, it's a very violent sport. People get injured left and right, and it's honestly a risk that you're taking with any player you sign, any player you draft. And it could happen. We've seen injuries like that happen in training camp, doing non-contact drills. Do you increase the risk a little bit as you get older? Sure. But I will say that Myles Garrett is also has more like power elements to his game. He's not so dependent on speed. So injury or not, I do think that there's a path where he ages more gracefully. And I don't want this whole conversation to revolve around Myles Garrett because like I said, there should be 31 teams in the NFL making phone calls to Cleveland to get an idea of what it costs. But I think it started my thought process of what are the biggest team needs here. And there's other guys that might become available. Somebody that I think would be an absolute lock as a fit in Buffalo might become available is Maxx Crosby with the Raiders. And, you know, Tom Brady put out, a social media post saying that he's going to do everything in his power to keep Crosby in Vegas. But he's got a very similar situation as Garrett does to the Browns. I mean, super elite level player with an organization that's just kind of been spinning their wheels. And, these dudes are competitors. They want to win Super Bowls. They want to, have success and legacy. And, I will say Cleveland is substantially more of a mess than Vegas, but I mean, Cleveland's right up there with New Orleans for teams that are just struggling with dysfunction. But a player like that, Trey Hendrickson has talked about, the possibility of wanting out. And like there's a lot of these teams that have to make tough decisions on players, and somebody ends up coming free. So, I mean, whether it's Garrett or not, I think that's, three bona fide studs in the edge room that you could bring in that completely changes the complexity of this defense. And I know football's not a sport that's, won and lost by one player, but a guy like Myles Garrett, a guy like Maxx Crosby, Trey Hendrickson, they come in and they immediately make everybody on your defense better. They make up for, you're having trouble covering receivers for more than 2.5 seconds. Don't worry, Myles Garrett, Garrett is getting back there. You think about the struggles that we've had across the defensive line, and one of the complaints out there about Ed Oliver is he doesn't take over a game by himself. He needs somebody playing next to him. Now, this isn't the player directly next to him, but if you're talking a defensive line with Groot, Ed Oliver, Daquan Jones eating up space, and then insert Myles Garrett, Maxx Crosby, how much better that whole defensive line gets because you have to worry about each player individually and it as a whole. So I think that there's a lot of areas on this team where I think we'll need to see improvement, where there's opportunity to improve. And I think it's going to come with some of the tough choices that we make. And we'll get into that in future episodes as we talk about, some of our pending free agents. If you don't have the appetite for bringing back Rasul Douglas, we have a need at cornerback. Did you like what you saw at safety this year? Cole Bishop taking another step, hopefully. But what do we do with DeMar Hamlin? There's all kinds of conversations to be had there as far as what the team should be like going into next year. But personally, as much as I, love the skill positions, it's fun, it's sexy, the NFL is proving time and time again that games are won and lost in the trenches, and it's an old cliche, and it's a cliche for a reason. But not only are we talking about a player of Garrett's caliber coming free, I mean, he's arguably the best defensive player in the league. On the other side of the ball, you have arguably the best offensive player in the league. Not going to get into the debate of where Allen lands on the list, whatever. He's not lower than 4, at least at the quarterback position. I mean, you're talking 2 of the best players in the league being leaders on each side of the ball that can, in moments, take over the games by themselves, and how much that could change everything for this team. So it's out there. We'll see what happens. Unfortunately, this happened so early in the off season schedule here, and if you get into all the roster cap gymnastics with Cleveland, if they do move Garrett, I think it makes the most sense for them to do it as a post June 1st move. So, I mean, we're sitting here February 5th, so probably going to be quite some time before we get any sort of resolution on this. But like I said, there's options out there, and it doesn't have to be Garrett. The messaging that I'm getting from Sean McDermott, the messaging that I'm getting from Brandon Beane is they're looking to add this type of player. And I think the fact that you have Garrett, Crosby, Hendrickson all seemingly, at least to some degree, available. You know, the Raiders can say Crosby isn't available all you want till you make him a sweet offer. And they're like, cool, we're rebuilding anyways. We could really use whatever, 2-3 extra early round picks. So probably quite some time before we get any sort of resolution on this. We'll keep tabs on it, have updates along the way as we move into the offseason. But like I said, kind of wanted to push back what I had planned for today's episode, because that's huge news. Position of need for the Bills. Says he wants to go to a contender. Bills were one game short of making it to the Super Bowl. And I mean, quite frankly, guys of that caliber just don't become available very often. So hope for the best there, and we'll see what happens. It'll certainly, for my money, I don't know what would end up being a bigger storyline for this offseason, but I don't know, man. Sports are going crazy. We got Luka getting traded to the Lakers. You never know what these teams have up their sleeves. But that's going to do it for this week's episode. Like I said, drop a comment if you got thoughts on this, if you're with it, if you're against it, why. Tell me I'm stupid, tell me I'm smart, whatever you want to do. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, particularly subscribe. As we get into the off season, news comes out all over the place. So scheduling might get a little bit messed up as we try to keep you as up to date as possible. And make sure you check out the website. Be greatly appreciated. We're doing some retooling over there, some new articles going up, some new merch hitting the website. So great way to support us. We appreciate every bit of support. Check it out. Jake's doing great work over there. Mike writing articles. Just a lot of exciting stuff going on. So thank you all for joining me on this week's episode on the journey with the podcast. And we will see you again next week. If nothing dramatic happens in the meantime, we're going to be kind of taking a deep dive into Brandon Beane this past off season in particular, and then just kind of his history since he's come to the team. So make sure you're subscribed and you don't miss that episode. Until then, and as always, go Bills!